I want us to look really closely at this notion of archive, which is going to be pretty foundational to our discussion. And I'm going to start with Marco with a pretty simple but weighted question. So how would you define this term archive?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, thanks, first of all. Thanks for the invitation, and really thanks for the director, everyone who hosted us today. So how to define an archive? It's a very difficult task, I think, and we can speak about archive in more practical terms. So it could be about a space, but especially during the 18th century, started to become associated with a depository of documents, so paper documents connected to bureaucratic practices and legislative practices. And then we can see a sort of changing in the meaning of archive throughout the 19th century and more specifically during the 20th century, opening up a bit this concept to other types of spaces which can not only be focusing on documents or paper materials, but also object. If we I would just put this quote, which is from a philosopher called Hans Stoller, who has been looking a lot in rethinking the role of archives in post-colonial studies and to rethink colonial histories in US, but not only Europe especially. And she has a quite interesting way of thinking about the archive to explain how archives and not become only places where we put documents or stuff, but also how we need to think their role in the way in which we develop knowledge about or culture about things. In fact, she speaks about archives as a space where we archive and collect and conserve things, but also from a more conceptual point of view. So the term archive, especially during the second part of the 20th century, with the work of many philosophers, has become a space of critique to think about all these different histories and these narratives, historical narratives that have been built. In the case of fashion, is quite an interesting path as well, because we could even say that archives have started actually in more traditional terms with paper and documents, and more, and today in a more general public perspective, we could say that when we think about fashion archive, we immediately think about garment. But that to some extent, if we want to be a bit more orthodox in the sort of history of archives, that should not be an archive, because archives were originally paper-based.
Of course. When you say you think of the archive as a space of critique, could you explain more what you mean by that?
Yeah, basically, I'm thinking about authors like Michel Foucault, I'm thinking about Michel de Certeau, Derrida, a lot of French, actually, writers who looked at archives to think about the ways in which society is building meaning, identity formation. A lot of work on Michel Foucault was about disrupting or rethinking the way in which we address sexuality, the way in which we address madness, and they were using the archive as a methodology. So they were going to the archive and looking at how this identity were constructed in different period of time. I think the clearest example is his work on madness, and he looks at how madness has changed and how people that were identified as mad changed throughout time, and he did that throughout by looking at archives and the archive of hospitals, archive of psychiatrist offices, and so on.
So on the one hand, we have this idea of the archive as just this sort of repository of historical documents, or this testament to events that have taken place in history. And then on the other side, you can see it as a tool that can be wielded to uncover narratives that were previously unknown or that previously hadn't been located.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so you talk about, or Anne Stoller talks about these two notions of archive as source and archive as subject. Do you see that distinction falling along similar lines of kind of the archive as just the historical documents in a neutral sense and the archive as a tool for critique? Or what do you think these two different terms of source and subject mean?
Well, I think it's a great distinction, I think, because on one way, it's more this idea of, especially if you look at different disciplines, historians would go to archive to rebuild stories or tell stories through documents and use the document as an evidence of a story, of a specific event. And the other side, the archive as a subject is also started a sort of tradition in thinking of writing a history of archives. So how we collect our history, how we collect our culture, and what are the forces behind this type of cultures. And a lot of work, again, has been has been also pushed on what is not in archives. So a lot of discussion has been on what is not preserved and what are the missing holes.
And so, Antoine, you founded Dicta, which is, as we said, this rare book, online rare books, rare documents, bookstore for fashion documents. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about what Dicta is, and then to kind of tack onto that, I'd love for you to tell us if you see Dicta as an archive, or do you see it as something else entirely?
We started Dictat with my partner something like 18 years ago, which starts to be a long time ago, and we started it as a bookstore because we were thinking that we needed books about fashion, but not necessarily new books about fashion, but sources that would be new sources to rewrite fashion history in a way to change a bit of the usual suspects when it comes to the iconography of fashion. Because if you look at many books about the history of fashion, then you find always the same type of pictures. And if you go to the archive, to the physical spaces where you can find archive, you can find new material and so on. And so we wanted to bring to, let's say, we wanted to bring awareness of existing other sources about fashion. And so we started by collecting out-of-print books. Then we extended to magazines. And then we extended to prints from the 16th century to the mid-20th century, then to photographs, then to ephemera, at-large invoices, invitation, and so on. All the things that were not supposed to be kept, all the things that were supposed to be destroyed by the passing of time because the value, let's say the function value of the object would kind of disappear. And so those things are usually not necessarily found in the usual institution that are supposed to keep archives, because fashion was not necessarily kept in public archive. And so we started to try to bring new elements and to make them visible. So we started to publish thematical catalogs with a very slow pace because we have issued 4 so far. So we take the time to have enough material to cover the kind of entirety of the subject. And this is something that stay in libraries. So all the kind of not unpublished sources, but let's say unseen sources are now visible through those catalogs. And we started to have a website back in 2005 where we display the item that we have and which we leave them available for public display. So people know that this book exists, even if it has been published in 50 copies, and this image exists, even if the print dates from the beginning of those 17th century and so on. And so we have this idea of bringing to the public some elements that were usually not completely seen or not even collected by public institutions, which are usually what we think when we think about archive, even if there's also private archives. So this is what Dictat has been doing for the past 18 years. And doing so, we have been in touch with research from the entire planet dealing with fashion because of the sources that you can't find elsewhere that becomes visible with us. And we've been dealing, we've been selling some of the items to private collectors, but mostly to public institutions. So those things that were not collected by public institutions starts to be collected by public institutions, whether it's museums, libraries, or even heritage department of fashion brands, which are now reconstituting archive that they did not kept ready before.
And so you've noticed that over time, since the founding of Dictat, these different historical entities, different institutions have started to take an interest in these so-called useless documents that wasn't previously demonstrated.
There's no let's say, rules about collecting them that exist in public institutions compared to other types of elements. If you create a company, the deed of the company is registered and is in archive, and you can find the deed. If you do a fashion invitation, the fashion invitation disappears and nobody collects it. It only comes into the museum when you start to have private collector, journalists, for example, fashion journalists who kept them throughout the time, artistic director who thought that they would be interesting pieces to keep. And so they would end up in museum through this kind of private collectors practices. So that's how those pieces would end up in museum, because there's no rules, general rules regarding that. So it's changing a bit in, let's say, the last 15 years, where there has been a new interest for ephemera, thanks to scholars like Marco, especially in the fashion.
Single-handedly generating interest in fashion ephemera.
And there's institutions that have taken, the blame is on you. And so institutions have started to embrace that more and more, and to include that more and more in the exhibitions. And there's even a new institution that has been created 3 years ago in 2020, which is called the Fashion Research Library, which is based in Oslo. Maybe you may say a few words.
It's a new attention. I don't know if you wanted to show.
We have a slide for it, but we're encountering technical difficulties.
I bet I can see that. Yeah.
But as we battle these technical difficulties, I wanted to ask you about a couple more. Okay, thank you.
Maybe I can say something about this, because I think the previous one is quite interesting.
Yes.
Because when Antoine was saying that there is no a real that, I mean, it's very difficult to think of a sort of policy or a history of collecting practices in fashion is different from other fields like art, like photography. Actually, there are some analogies with photography, but in fashion, a lot of archive, especially if we think about fashion as an industry, are actually almost organically created by brands. And this is very interesting because it changes from country to country. And we put you here an example of some materials from the Ferragamo archive. We were there with our program last weekend, and that was a self-generated archive to some extent. And this was, I mean, there was not the ambition, there was not an understanding of archive as a cultural space, but it was an understanding of archive as a professional space. So as a place, something to cap in order to create new materials. And that's quite a particularity for Italy. This happened already during the 30s and 20s. So that sort of practice of organically keeping materials is quite developed in Italy. For example, in France, it'd be less because there is a less industrial history or different than for example, in Italy, where families were also owners of these brands, and it was part of a sort of internal family album, we could say, tradition. While the next one is more about reflecting on a shift that we see during the 1980s, and this is a very interesting issue from Vogue, which was it's a March issue 1980, and it was during the year of l'année du patrimoine, so the year of heritage in France, which was not connected to fashion at all. Yeah. But here Vogue decided to dedicate an entire issue to that. They shoot haute couture at a time where haute couture was actually at risk. So it was not a moment, let's say, it was not the best time for haute couture in worldwide. And actually there was the advent of Japanese and Italians ready to wear. And there we see a sort of early seed of the way in which France at large, but through the support of government and other institutions and the industry, really recenter the discourse about Frenchness through couture.
And so, Antoine, I was talking with you about this as well, and you described it as the heritage boom. Can you tell us what this word means and how heritage has become so central to the practices of fashion archiving?
Yes, so in the late 1970s and 1980s, you all remember the Thatcher's years. So it's a moment when we start to have this idea that Europe, let's say, should be only people in white collars, and all the factories should be removed from that space to be outsourced, first in Southern Europe and then in North Africa, and now it's Southeast Asia. And so there was this idea of a changing society. And during that moment when a society changed—
and this is changing society through fashion, through what we're producing and wearing.
Part of it, but the idea is more like at that moment when there's discomfort because it's changing time, people find comfort where in the past. And it's a moment when you think that it's something new, then you want to safeguard a bit what the traditions were. And so there's a kind of dynamic that is at that moment trying to safeguard what used to be. And so we have a rise of the number of museums at that moment in, let's say, westernized countries, and a rise of what would be heritage facilities. And there's this awareness also in fashion of a kind of international competition. At that moment in the 1980s, you've got the rising ready-to-wear in the United States. Italy is also at that moment reshaping the identity of what fashion is supposed to be in Italy. And France, which was usually associated with haute couture was almost dying at that moment. And so France started to have this kind of care about heritage. It's this moment when we redo completely Le Louvre to turn it into a museum rather than a palace, half a museum with the giant entrance and so on. And it's a moment when the state starts also to create a space in Le Louvre where the fashion show should take place. So this is really kind of fashion led by state decisions within this idea of, let's say, empowering the Frenchness of fashion and building the identity of what French fashion is supposed to be and trying to safeguard it too. And this moment is also the moment when we start to have the fashion museum starting to find their spaces. In Paris, you have had different associations that were willing to have a museum for costume, for fashion, but they did not find a space, they did not find things. And it's only in 1977 that Galliera becomes Galliera. I mean, that the Museum of Fashion settled in Galliera, and the one at MAD, what is today MAD, only opened in 1986, which is really this moment in the late 1970s and early 80s when this is when we care about heritage and starting to make exhibitions about contemporary designers or brands that are still alive. One of the first exhibitions that the MAD does is about Dior in 1987, and which forced Dior to look back on their own history and in their own archive. And it's the moment when we have a Balmain exhibition too. So all those brands start to think about, we should do something with the archive, and we should start managing the archive a different way than we used to do. So what the Italian used to do and what Marco described with this idea of having an archive as a working tool, it's something that we had also in all the Parisian couture houses. All the Parisian couture houses would have a textile library, would have an in-house library where they would find inspiration. And this type of archive would be an archive, a living archive. And so that's something that existed, but once the brand is dead, all that ends up somewhere else because there's no one to keep a brand alive when the brand is bankrupted, is terminated. What do you do with the archive? Who pays for storage of millions of drawings and so on and so on? So all those things disappear or sometimes are collected by private collectors who think that there's something to save at that moment. And so the 1980s are really this moment when we start to care about the archive of fashion and when the heritage department in Fashion Archive starts to be created. And with that moment that we have this kind of crave for heritage, you have brands like Chanel, which was close to be bankrupted at that moment, which decides to hire Karl Lagerfeld. And what does Karl Lagerfeld do? He does some historicist type of dynamic, which is bringing elements from the past, update them for the present. And to do that, you have to know your heritage. But if you don't have a heritage department and a history of Chanel, back in the 1980s, you did not have that many books about Chanel. And so you have to create this archive so that you can build the brand upon. So those moments are key moments for the creation of Fashion Archive and which last until, let's say, today, and which are really this kind of pivotal moment.
It's so interesting that we're seeing such a kind of meeting point between the idea of the brand and idea of the national identity. Because you've both, as we've talked about it, you've specifically talked about an Italian tradition, you've talked about a French one. And when you're talking about the heritage boom, it seems to me like you're talking simultaneously about heritage in terms of fashion heritage, the heritage of specific brands, their lineage, their development, and their current status. And then the heritage in terms of what we as people who are in possession of different kind of tenuous, unstable national identities considered to be properly belonging to us. So how do you navigate this distinction between national heritage and fashion or brand heritage? What is this relationship between brand and national identity?
I just want to say, I want to specify that this is 1980, and this was a national campaign which didn't involve fashion at all. So it's not only about the 80s and fashion. I think it's a period where a lot of government, especially in the Western world, started to create or selling culture, basically, and understand, as Antoine was saying, the value of culture at large. And if we look at the 1980s, it's really something connected to the creation of folklore and the institutionalization of folklore and heritage at large. And that's why it becomes quite at odds when we put fashion and heritage together, because heritage, discourse on heritage and national identity is really connected to the culture at risk. So things which are, think about the role of UNESCO, for example. While if we, we just bring back discourse to fashion, which is an interesting culture at risk, we could say.
Well, it's so interesting also that you've used the word folklore, because in my head, when we're talking about haute couture, that's the total opposite of folklore, which is in its essence, the folk, the natural people. And yet in some way we're seeing the two unified through this notion of heritage.
And the term heritage, if you take it from a pure, a lot of discourse came from Anglo-Saxon, in culture and Anglo-Saxon environment, and it will never, I had a lot of discussion with colleagues in UK, will never associate the term heritage to fashion because of this aspect of privilege. So that's a bit of a dichotomy that happens.
What do you mean by privilege there?
It's not a culture at risk, like a lot of, it's not the idea of historical site, for example, is something that it's really that's what we're trying to do in the work at Parsons, is to try to create a bridge between this idea of cultural history, which is really what also developed a larger discourse on heritage during the 1970s and 80s in UK, for example, really connected to working class, really connected to, lower classes, and will hardly be connected to haute couture, or which was, of course, very elitist as a form of production. So in that sense, the idea between brand heritage and national heritage, fashion is an interesting space to look at the dialogue between them.
And it's interesting that you've talked about how class situates into this as well, and the presence of working class labor that goes into the construction of haute couture and of fashion. And this actually permits us to turn more towards the discussion of fashion ephemera, because when you look at fashion ephemera, so much of the value of studying these objects is that they reveal these hidden processes of labor that aren't necessarily kind of visible when you adhere to the notion of the single great auteur who is creating these things single-handedly and is not actually reliant upon a socio-political system. And so I want to switch the direction a little bit to talk about fashion ephemera, and I'm realizing I've repeated this word ephemera many, many times, and we have not actually arrived at a definition. So in order to just establish the basis for this discussion, I'll start with you again, Marco, because you've written the book on fashion ephemera. Can you tell me what this word ephemera means and what you understand by fashion ephemera? And then we'll turn to Antoine to answer the same question.
Examples. Well, it's first of all, it's an Anglo-Saxon term. It comes from, we can find a sort of etymology in both in Greek and Latin, but it's really was used to define, transient things. It was been associated to fever, has been associated to a type of a mayfly, has been used in medical discourse, has been used in botanic discourse. And then during the end of the 1980s, it becomes, 18th century, becomes more associated to paper documents. A bit earlier, but in English-speaking countries, it becomes really the word used to define all this paper material. So even before printing techniques, so even handwritten and paper materials, which have a very specific functional use. So things that a very good example of an ephemera is a metro ticket. So that's an ephemera. But what is interesting about the term ephemera is that an object like a metro ticket becomes ephemera when you keep it. So there is a transformation of function. and value embedded in the very idea of ephemera. So that's what we usually define as ephemera. So all those flimsy transient materials, usually paper mainly, then, it kind of shift, but we could say that, that are escaping to some extent their death by being preserved by someone. And and the term ephemera has become the term used a lot of from librarian, especially, to conserve all these type of transient materials that escape books, the definition of photography of books, and allow, as you said, to map other type of system and other ways to think about history as well.
And Antoine, you were saying earlier when you were talking about how you found a dictat, that you were finding these objects that had in some way outlived their use or outlived their function, but then had kind of quite stubbornly continued to live anyways, which was reminding me of a quote from Marco's book, Fashion Remains, where he says that the study of fashion ephemera grew from a need to recognize how ephemera in the archive metaphorically became something else. In a sense, they outlived their functionality and so were transformed into something else. So what do you think about this relationship between ephemera and use and outliving use? And how do you approach that? And how does dictat maintain that within the structure of its project?
So yes, the ephemera is linked with a lost use, but which should not be obliterating all the different values that are embedded in a document. And there's often some very interesting information for researchers in those documents, or artistic value, because if it's Magritte who did the drawing for an invitation for a Belgian couture house such as Norine, you've got a print by Magritte that was not made in hundreds and hundreds of copies, and so you have a kind of aesthetic value attached to it. You can have an economic value attached to it. You can have an historical value. We have invoices that were made for the sister of Napoleon for his crowning as an emperor. So there's elements that are part of history and historical value. So they are multifaceted objects, an object that even if they lost their use, are still having the different dimension than that an object can have. But you have to find that value that the document have, and a document for an economic historian can be, the value for an economic historian can be different from an art historian, and which will be different from a brand perspective if they're dealing with heritage, to reuse it for naming a product or for reshaping a package for a perfume bottle and so on. So there's those different uses that are kind of fascinating with those objects if you're able to make them talk in a way. And so that's what we liked about those objects, that the font, the logo type and all that tells the story of the time and are kind of element witnesses of the past. And so even if the use is lost, it's a part of a witness of a complete network system, and fashion is about network. And so this is bringing also dimension of authorship, of labor, hidden labor, as we were saying. So all the objects are very interesting objects, and which are kind of survivors. So which is quite interesting to have this kind of army of survivor at home, trying to be seen, wanting to be seen.
Well, I'd love to get into these, specific soldiers in the army of survivors, and we have some really moving examples here, because I do think we should stress the ephemera are quite moving. They have a certain weight and power to them when you look at them and you realize that they are both testaments to a time that has passed, but also something that has endured into the present. And it really, I think, puts into emphasis the instability of the value of objects once they have exceeded their initial value that was assigned to them, that they can come to mean anything, they can be worth anything to anyone, and that's quite in flux, and that you both get to be actors in this kind of network of assigning different values to them. So if we'll move through our slides, we've had to skip some because we have so much to talk about, but let's start with this fax right here. Could you tell us what this is and why it's valuable to you?
Yes, so it's a fax. So nobody knows what a fax is anymore. So I see some
I
students.
certainly don't, yeah.
So what is interesting that nobody keeps fax, right? And so this one was kept by Massaro. So I don't know if you're familiar with Massaro, but this is the most important bootmaker in Paris, the one who has worked with Chanel in the 1950s, who has invented the two-color shoe, you know, the one that make the legs looks longer because it's like flesh and then stops with a kind of tip, which is black tip. So it elongates the leg, and at the same time, it's not giving you the idea of Bigfoot because there's a kind of stop in collar. So that shoe that we associate with Chanel was not invented by Chanel herself because she was not making shoes, but invented by Massaro. And so Massaro is very important shoemaker, and Massaro used to also keep on doing shoes for Chanel when Karl Lagerfeld was designing for Chanel. But even if we know that Massaro did the shoes, we don't really know about the design process between Karl and Massaro, because usually Karl was working at home and only bringing the drawings to the office. And so all the research process attached to what Karl was doing in terms of inspiration and design is still a bit in the dark. It will come into light with the next exhibition of the Met Costume Institute, but so far we don't really know what was happening there. And so what is interesting that these drawings that were faxed to Massaro were kept by Massaro. So Massaro attached a value to it, probably an emotional value to it. And those drawings are telling us what Karl is taking as references for designing the shoe, talking about Poulain, which are that very medieval type of shoe, and trying to find also an analogy with the Pinocchio nose, and on another drawing, there's a kind of cap, which is also reusing this kind of long shoe aesthetics. And so those things which were not supposed to have survived because nobody cares usually about this design process, it's part of the design process, have been kept by Massaro, and are those kind of remains or traces of these kind of exchanges that, since Massaro died and Karl died, we have no longer traces of them. So this is quite interesting to have this kind of elements as those hidden moments of creations. And even if nobody really cares about a fax as an object, those are embedded in the value about the design process between those two.
Well, it's interesting because on the one hand, it reveals to us a certain hidden facet of the creative process, which isn't normally on display when one considers the final project. On the other hand, it also reveals something to us about the designers themselves and about their own processes of attaching value to objects. And this makes me think of that quote that I read from your work earlier, Marco, about the transformation that takes place when one considers the fashion ephemera, that it has been transformed from something into this metaphorical something else. And when you write about this, you also write about a sort of interplay between the material and the immaterial, the sort of imaginary value attached to fashion ephemera. Could you tell us a little bit more about this interplay between material, immaterial, and the transformations that take place?
Yeah. It's quite complex in terms of the material and immaterial. I think it's the point was really to try to speak about this relation. I mean, Antoine spoke about a sentimental value, for example, or all this. It's like fluctuating forms of value that are created around the life of the object, and that's a bit of. I mean, that's a lot of the part of the material aspect that we can see, and ephemeral. I mean, I think in any object we can speak about this relation, but ephemera kind of show us in a very clear way how the materiality and especially in the materials I was looking at, which are a bit different from this, we can there was a play also by graphic designers and designers themselves, and they were using specific type of paper, specific type of font and writing to create almost a material link between an ideology behind the creation of his ephemera, so this question of authorship and the performance of authorship, while at the same time they had a physical meaning. So
Yes.
yeah, but we can see also, I mean, for example, here.
Well, let's talk about this subject of authorship, actually, and let's turn to a specific invitation that's you discuss quite at length in your book. I'm skipping through a lot of these, but you can all go on Dictat's website and look at them in your free time. skip a
But
bit
because
more.
I think what it's interesting, for example, here there are different types of ephemera,
Yes.
and that's why was trying to say before,
yes.
the typical ephemera is really a flimsy object that has no value in theory. That's why I make always the example of a ticket, of a metro ticket, because in theory, when you buy it, it's like what they changed now the cost in Paris as well, but it was €1.20. I think now it's a bit more expensive. But then once you finish your trip in a metro, then it completely lost, and then becomes ephemera. The one that Antoine is showing us are for very important ephemera because they hardly collected by museums. While the one because they are business received, and these materials all are inside the brand, and most of the time very jealously kept, or they really disappear. So this, the facts, these were to some extent real ephemera in the proper way of thinking about ephemera. The one I look at in my book goes inside the category of ephemera, but they were already performed ephemera, if I want, and I can explain. So Antoine was really in the work of the dictat. They kept a receipt, the facts. So real functional communication to some extent between a designer, between a shoemaker, between a press. While mine, the one I look in my book, and it's in a case study on archive, are promotional materials. So they are promotional materials. In my work, I mainly look at contemporary work, and a category of designers who were playing around this idea of communication and all these different discourses that you can create. This one is from Maison Martin Margiela. For me, was quite interesting in terms of authorship.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about that. And I think what you're saying is so interesting as well, because it seems almost like the very act of studying ephemera kind of nullifies its status as ephemera, that to study it is to bring it into the archive, and that somehow placing it in the archive negates its character of ephemerality. And this also will bring us to questions of the kind of self-reflexivity of creating these objects that these designers knew they would enter into some sort of archive at some point. But we've arrived back at this question of authorship, which we see specifically with this invite in the corner that has all the signatures on it. And this invite is from Margiela, I believe. Yes. And I want to ask you, kind of using this invitation as an example, how fashion ephemera complicate what we understand the notion of the singular author to be, and what they do to this notion of authorship.
Yeah, I think that's the great contribution we can say that ephemera can do to historiography, fashion historiography, but at large, I would say, because they disrupt an idea of the designer as a genius. And
can you tell us what this invitation is as well?
This is particularly, this does it in many different ways. Maison Martin Margiela is a brand created by this Belgian designer and another partner at the beginning by Martin Margiela, and he was in himself trying to disrupt this idea of authorship in the fashion industry. He started working alone at the end of the 1980s, at a time when you have a lot of superstar designers using their self as a sort of as a message to some extent. So the creation of a myth of a designer, putting their body, putting their face to a brand. Margiela entered this system, and from the very beginning, despite some examples, he really decided to change the communication. So it was not about him, but it was part of a collective. It was part of the process. We go back. And this invitation, for example,
why do we
was 1989 or 1990. I'm blind, so I think it's 1990.
And so what are these signatures?
So a signature, basically, it plays on this idea of, at the time, for example, if you go to Dictact, you will see many example invitation during 1950s, 1960s. It was a letter, an invitation sent by the brand to the people attending. So journalists, buyers, client, and there was always a signature by the designer or by the couturier. Here he plays on this idea, so he creates this signature. He invites the press and so on, but he asks all the team to sign it. So this idea of collaborativeness and also to speak about a group of people participating to the creation of fashion is something that for him was very important. And again, he will never appear in, he will always speak about the we, he will never give interviews. And I think that is a very early example. But what I really like about this is the postcard, which was an invitation, which again used handwriting, which is a very personal trait. And it actually is Madame Margiela handwriting.
How can you confirm that?
Because you can see, I mean, if you if you study, there is actually a very interesting documentary that he did after they did another documentary to kind of recall authorship. So I think we can also say that everyone wants a bit to have a bit of credit of their work. So we did this this documentary responding to another documentary that he didn't work on, and so they did it outside his permission, and it's called Margiela in his own words, and he shows his early writings, so you can actually make a connection between the two, and he used a lot of handwriting, but he never signed it with his own name. And I think this is quite interesting in terms of both the materiality of the handwriting as a form of authorship in itself, but also the idea of the postcard as a very personal and intimate relationship. So to some extent, you can see from this example that they really, Margiela, but there are other example during that time of designers who played with discourses, with languages of this type of materials, and this also the ideologies behind an industry, because when you send a letter to invite someone on the show, you kind of performing intimacy, you're performing a connection
as well.
Yes. Yeah.
You're deciding who gets to come, who doesn't. You're in charge of access.
And it's quite familiar way, because you don't
yes.
send, usually we send postcard nowadays. Nobody does anymore, but at the time it was for friends.
I've sent a postcard before.
No, but not referring to.
No, but and it says, for those who can't read it, it says chers amis, and then nous vous invitons. So it's also this playing with this nous, this third person plural, and then chers amis, which is a very familiar way to address someone. We're rapidly running out of time, which is what always happens when we have conversations like this. And before we open up to our audience, there's just two last points I want us to touch on at the speed of light. I want us to talk about something we've discussed, something that you discussed in your book, which is the digital turn for fashion and for the fashion archive, and what this is going to mean for ephemera. So what has the advent of the digital done for the notion of ephemera and for the fashion archive? Start with Antoine, and then we can go to Marco.
Well, my job, our job at Dictat is focusing on, let's say, from the mid 16th century to the mid 20th century. So we are kind of not looking too much into
this isn't a problem for you.
So this is not a problem for me as Dictat. This is a problem for me as a faculty member of Parsons and dealing with history of mediation.
And what is that problem?
And so that's a problem because the ephemerality of a post, a reel, but also an Instagram account, when you have a new designer, some brands decide to erase all the previous posts. And so the idea of conserving or archiving ephemerality of fashion brands is an issue for researchers, of course, but also for brands. What do they keep from those digital communication campaign that they do? What is the difference between the designer's account and the account of the brand? And so there's, with the digital moment, a creation of digital content, which is bringing issues about conservation of them. And it's an issue, of course, for fashion brands if they want to keep an archive of them. It's an issue for researchers who can't access this type of material anymore. But this is the same issue with public institutions, because the evolution of formats, of standards, makes it extremely difficult for institutions to know how do we keep what we keep. Do we still have microfilm? Do we still have floppy disk? What do we do? You probably, some of you in the audience might have experienced faxes and CD-ROMs, but for some younger generations, CD-ROMs are kind of weird object. How do we keep all those elements when there's this evolutions of standards is a daily challenge for archivists, but which is also now more and more, because fashion is about this ephemerality, about this permanent buzz and creation of events. How do we keep them? How do we keep traces of them? And which one do we keep? So this is a huge issue, both for the industry in this kind of memory of the industry, and for researchers in fashion study when they want to access that type of material.
Marco, in your book, you talk about finding a QR code that was meant to direct you towards a specific archival location, and when you scanned it, it no longer existed. And that became the sort of erasure or absence of this moment of fashion memory for you. Could you tell us about that?
It was another Margiela invitation, actually. It was 2012. And I think was a perfect end of a book, because I was also, I mean, I was looking at very specific period of time, the 90s and early 2000. And then a new ephemerality is, of course, online. We did actually a project with Fashion Europeana trying to create a sort of database for some online thing. It was extremely problematic. We were doing snapshot, and a snapshot is not dynamic. Museums are struggling with these materials. So there is this question of what are the future remains to some extent, and start to question also what should we keep, and internet make us face this problem even more, and because there is a huge amount of production, and also is, as Antoine was saying, I mean, it's also about thinking a sort of archaeology of media, and how these things that are happening in other fields can be then translated into fashion.
We're ending up on a very unstable note, looking towards the very unclear and frightening future. Can we have a big round of applause very quickly? I would like to open it up to questions now. We don't quite have as much time as we should, but we can all talk fast. That's okay. So we'll start with our audience here in the room. Raise your hand if you have a question. Don't be shy. Yes.
Thanks. I'm surprised that the term nostalgia didn't come up in this discussion, and nostalgia is a way of, I think, counterbalancing instability. So is this something that you're thinking about? And while I have the mic, completely separate question, tell me about your cataloging scheme at Dictat, for example.
Well, nostalgia is interesting because there's emotions attached to it, and emotion of a kind of lost time. So there's a bit of an interesting emotional response, which is not necessarily the response that has been built upon when we think of those fashion archives. Most of the time, they're more industrial type of archive. They're more art historical type of archive, and the kind of oral history and memories is something that has developed quite recently. And there's very interesting project that has been led. I mean, FIT did one about the history of 7th Avenue in New York, with having oral testimony interviews of former employees from the 7th Avenue and so on. And so having a kind of oral record of the past. So this is also kind of really short moments that kind of vanished, or moments of an history that is vanishing, which is interesting type of record. Is that ephemera? Is that, I'm not sure. It's more into archive than ephemera. So when it comes to ephemera and the way that we classify them, we kind of follow the idea of books, magazine, periodicals, prints in the very traditional sense of prints, etching, copper engraving, steel engraving, so a kind of traditional type of classification. When it comes to photograph, it's also a specific category. And then there's a kind of wider category of paper, let's say old paper, as we would call them in French, vieux papier, which used to be a depreciative type of terms to talk about that, like paperwork, which is also something that was very interestingly studied at the end of the 19th century by the people defending those vieux papier. And so we would have a kind of section that would be dealing more with ephemera, printed matters in a way. So that would be our scheme in establishing the different types of pieces we might have. But it's hard because it's a large category in which you can have boxes in which you can have paper wraps, in which you can have invitations, invoices. So very large type of category with a wide range of elements, but we mostly rely on paper because it can be also fans that were made for advertisements. So it's large category.
Maybe there is an element of nostalgia, I think, of course, in this, and it can be connected to personal memories, can be connected to collective memories. And I think what is very interesting about nostalgia is that we see now online a lot of brands, so we go back, who are actually using VHS, fax, and it's just almost like that's why we're speaking about an archaeology of media, because they are kind of retaking a lot of devices that were used in the 70s, in the 80s, and the 90s as a form of nostalgic and a nostalgic way to look at the industry back at the time. So Balenciaga, for example, did it, and it's clearly that is going back to a period of time where the fashion industry was very different. So there is both a nostalgia of media, but also nostalgia of the ideologies behind an industry.
More questions? Yes.
I would like to ask a question about, you talked about the present and the past, and I wanted to ask you about what you think about the metaverse and this Web3 and how ephemera will be like our notion of fashion in this new world, of this possible dystopian future, if that may be, and what you think about that.
Well, if you look back already 10 or 15 years ago, we started already to have some metaverse spaces. I mean, you might have heard of Second Life, which is kind of same things, and you started to have Christian Dior presenting jewelry collection in that space with this kind of pixelized type of environment, which is quite interesting. But if you think of this idea of kind of non-physical type of fashion or type of, let's say, of media, if you go back to the 1940s, you started to have telephotographs. So what are telephotographs? That's a photograph that can be taken here and wired to another place where you had a machine that would print that photograph. So this idea of digital matters is not necessarily that new. What is new is maybe turning it into a universe where there's no materiality associated to it, but this is something that starts to develop, but it's like some weird wizard so far, you know, people not really knowing what to do. It's like NFT. Everybody talks about NFT. Auction houses starts to sell NFT, sometimes not even matching the definition of what an NFT is. So everybody's trying to find a space there. Everybody is trying to set a foot here just in case it would be something. So for the moment, it's still the beginning of it. But as with social medias, all the brands have been kind of trying to find what to do on the social media first, because they were not designed for brands. So there's always this kind of adaptation process. For the metaverse, it's a bit soon, let's say, and I'm not sure what the future of those spaces will be about. If you really want to buy a pair of sneakers for your avatar, a Gucci sneakers, it works. I mean, they sell some, but is it really the future of fashion? I'm not sure. Maybe younger generation might have an opinion on that, and they think maybe that's the future and that's where they want to buy sneakers for their avatars. So far, I'm not completely sure, and I'm not completely sure about the kind of extent in terms of geographical and community spaces in which this is an interesting dynamic. So I'm looking forward to see what happens. So far, it's a bit of witchcraft, and I'm still puzzled about what will actually become in terms of industrial matters, physically money-making type of products.
Marco, would you like to respond, or we can answer this
I
question?
can just say that I was in a chat with someone who actually does this, is an agency who support luxury industry. And what he was saying, I mean, I really have no knowledge about that, so I wouldn't say it from my own brain. But what he was saying, it was very interesting, is that it's a very small industry for fashion. And the big industry there is actually gaming, and it's a completely different production. And he was saying that fashion brands at the moment are just reacting to it, just doing one example, and then just to check, they say, okay, we did it. And that for him was like actually the real problem, because and the people who actually could bring it to a next level are people working already for gaming industry, but they're not really bothered, because the money and the economic result that come from gaming are, I mean, 100, I mean, much more, valuable than what the industry is actually produced, the fashion industry is actually producing. So it was an interesting thing for me to hear also.
Last question right here. Yes.
Hi, so this brings me back to the classroom. Very happy to be here. I was wondering, as archivists, if there's something that you see in present day that you're thinking, wow, this is really special, really unique. I think this deserves some focus, and the kinds of things that you think archivists might be focusing on from modern day, 50 years from now, let's say.
You are the archivist somehow. No.
I don't know. I think there's, since the 1990s, a renewal interest in ephemera and in the physical form of it. And Marco has talked about it. And more today, we have this take on ephemerality by brands. I mean, if you want to go to the Balenciaga show, sometimes they give you an iPhone with the indication on it. And so there's the kind of fetishization of the object that is now taking an important part of it. So there might be in this kind of side production something to be aware of, and maybe to keep an open eye on it. So this ephemeral material becomes something more and more valuable, staged by the brand itself, as if in a kind of post-90s, 2000, this importance of the ephemerality of that object has almost blown up in a way. And so they become more and more important, and at the same time, they become more and more useless in a way. So they've lost something in this kind of inflation process, because when you have a fashion week in New York, a fashion week in London, a fashion week in Milan, a fashion week in Paris, a couture week in Paris, a couture week, a second couture week in Paris, a male fashion show, and so on, if you're a fashion journalist, you get thousands of invitations per year and goodie bags and so on. What do you keep? Well, you don't keep everything, and you have to find a way to decide what is important or not, what is to be kept or not. What is interesting is that museums now collect those type of invitations, or are on the mailing list of the brands, or try to find ways to get the journalists donate the invitation. So what is interesting is that this ephemerality is not taken into account by museums for kind of contemporary fashion. So that would be a kind of reassuring element about this new type of ephemera, but which becomes less interesting and more about what is the next new ephemera, rather than the idea of constructing an aesthetic, constructing a discourse with a specific network, which was what was at stake with Raf Simons, Martin Margiela, and so on back in the 1990s.
And expand a bit the idea of what fashion is. We didn't have the time to speak about that, but there is now a lot of attention towards rethinking archives. So a lot of other type of materials, like everyday photograph, others, everyday practices, can become new ways also to expand what we mean by fashion. Right. Also for things that are not inside the archive.
And it's expanding the idea of authorship to not just the designer and this idea of brand, but to the hidden labor forces. And that is the most interesting things. How do we collect memory of that? And how we collect new types of ephemera attached to this labor?